We're told that Africa is alive with possibility, but we also know that there's a shadow, and that shadow is often not spoken to, is often not confronted. It takes Prince Charles to come to Africa to warn us that major global corporations are buying up massive tracts of agricultural land. We know that poverty is pandemic. We know that HIV and AIDS has certainly not been solved and by no means has reached a plateau. We know that there are countless problems. And here in South Africa right now, we're sitting with a crisis. 34 people were killed last week. Our leaders are bickering and fighting and asking who's responsible, blaming, who takes responsibility? And where do we sit in this? What are we going to do about it? Today, what I'd like to do is propose that in this country, first and foremost, what we need to do is go back to the principle of Ubuntu, the notion of I am who I am because of you. And we need to find ways in which to instill that in embodied ways in our learning systems. I'm a drama therapist, I'm a drama educator, I'm someone who loves making theater. So my talk is framed by that love and passion. But the question of how can we get to that place where we can really embrace Ubuntu so that we can begin to grieve the grieving that needs to be done in this country so that we can move on. The challenge that people like Desmond Tutu, Mampela Rampela, many others have proposed to us. So a few years ago, I was living in Botswana, and I was about to come here to Wits University, and I was invited to a dinner by a couple who were involved in development work. And they were from Germany and had spent many years in Africa, and they really believed that theater could change people's attitudes. And they proposed to me, could I make a piece of theater about HIV and AIDS and led that tour around the SADC region? And I laughed at them, and I said, people have been doing that for years, and it hasn't worked. Nothing's changed. And out of that conversation grew an idea. And that idea began with an appraisal mission in which we traveled across Africa to a number of countries, and then did research in other countries through surveys and that. What we were looking at was how theater was surviving in those countries. What were people doing? And how was theater being used to communicate this major crisis that we were facing? What we did know is that drama is the most extensively used medium across Africa, particularly in rural areas, in order to convey these messages. What we did discover, however, was this extraordinary poverty of ideas. An extraordinary poverty of ideas. And an exploitation of artists that was really very difficult to confront. So governments were only too happy, and NGOs and donor organizations to use artists. We need a little play, and we'd like you to make sure that the message is right. And if the money comes from the George Bush administration, well, then the message needs to be ABC around HIV and AIDS. Or if it's this donor, this is what that needs to be done. You will perform before we begin the work. The messaging was simplistic. It didn't engage the audience. The symbolism, if there was any, revolved around this idea that HIV and AIDS was this demon. I don't know how many of you grew up with that idea of this really evil, bad thing that was happening. Certainly your parents would have grown up or would have known about that. Because in the early days of the HIV and AIDS pandemic, the kind of imagery used by artists and government departments in that had everything to do with fear, driving this unbelievable fear into people, but not changing anything. And all it did was exacerbate extraordinary stigma and discrimination. I remember one drama in Swaziland. First of all, we had been told by the group, don't talk to those people, those artists, don't do this, don't do that. And it was all about who was getting money and who wasn't getting money, because artists live on so little, because they're disrespected. But in this drama, HIV was painted as this demon dressed in red, and along came everybody to hack HIV to death. Well, we know what happened in South Africa. A number of women were stoned to death. But we continue, and communities continue, and don't have the space to grieve. So we were presented with a few problems. The material poverty of people, the physical poverty, the poverty of imagination, of how to even begin to address a problem so great, the poverty of a relationship, and the poverty of soul in every respect. And really what we were confronted with was, how could we address this in a way that would change people's attitudes and would change the way we relate to one another? And so it required some kind of extraordinary leap of faith. And so we began this program called Drama for Life here at Wits University. And the idea was to bring many students from all over Africa to come and study together. Our idea was to try and source a vision. The African wisdom asks us to awake to the dreams visited to us in our sleep by our ancestors. So the question was, what was the dream that we were not listening to? And I'd like to share a dream here that I had when I went on a journey to go and study. And it's a dream that's come back to me because of TEDx, and it's made me reconsider what I've been doing in the last few years. It was at the time that Nelson Mandela became president of South Africa. And I share this dream because TEDx says you must make yourself vulnerable to your audience, but also because this dream has a collective memory, that it's not just my dream. I dreamt just before I left South Africa to go and study in New York that I was in this, picture this area, beautiful rolling green lawns, thorn bushes, rocks, stones, lots of young people, your age and younger, sitting around, standing around, talking, engaging with one another in the most relaxed atmosphere, big, open African landscape, sky blue. And I was standing there, and Nelson Mandela was standing next to me. And he took me by the hand, and I still remember, in my body what that feeling was like in that dream, of my hand being held by someone else, of that caliber and strength. And he led me through this landscape, and it was easy, and it was light, and we were talking. And then he took me into this building of rock, stone, and it was this sacred space, but empty, filled with beautiful light. And the dream ended there. And I struggled for a long time personally what that dream was about. But for me, that dream today really is about what kind of education do we need to create in order to address the 21st century here in Africa. What kind of education, what kind of space and spaces will allow us to reimagine who we are? Because what is happening right now is not working. It's not working in the private schools because that's a very particular education that produces a very particular student who has an individual sensibility and sees no real relationship to the larger context, and who often sees the ultimate destiny of leaving this continent. And it's certainly not working in our government schools, and I don't need to talk about that. So we began to create this program, and of course our passion is about drama, and our exploration was around exploring the relationship between applied drama, drama in education, and drama therapy. And our interest was in creating dialogue for social transformation purposes. So we were not talking just about theater, but actually just using our imaginations in relationship to reality. That notion of, just imagine if it was you who Nelson Mandela was leading through those grounds, and he took you into your space, and he said, here, create, begin, imagine. It's as simple as that, really. And our program is also based on the principle of an engagement of the intrapersonal, the self, and the interpersonal, the engagement between me and you. And for us, that is absolutely essential. And it's about creating contexts of meaning. And what do I mean by that? That it's about relationships. The relationship to me, you, our community, our university, our country, and other countries on this continent. And I believe one of the things that will help us begin to shift out of this space that really is about a traumatized space where we're constantly fixed. People keep on saying in South Africa, we keep on getting locked into a position. Well, you know what? You'll discover the rest of the world if you begin to engage with the rest of Africa. And that's what we try to do. That's what we are trying to do with our program. So some basic principles. Our classes cannot consist of more than 50% of South Africans. We have to engage the rest of the world. And we need to acknowledge that Africa has an extraordinarily rich history that we can learn from. And it's in that bringing everybody together, and particularly older, mature people, that we can learn from one another. For us, HIV and AIDS represents so much more than just a medical illness. It's about confronting gender, sexual relationships, sexual identities, religion, race, class. There's so many sides to this problem that we need to engage with. I'm going to tell you another story because this may symbolize the kind of work that we're beginning to engage with. And it will speak to the problems that we need to engage in terms of discrimination and stigma. We have a theater company that we've developed, one of our graduates developed, and it was an experiment. It's called playback theater. So you have a group of 4 actors, you have a musician, and you have someone called a conductor. And you work with an audience. And we did this in Pietermaritzburg. It was part of a big festival, and which is what we try and do, create these spaces where people feel comfortable to come together in order to really penetrate the discrimination and stigma that exists. And the idea is that you, the audience member, tells your story, and we perform your story back immediately. And we do it in a symbolic process, obviously with deep care. And there was a young woman that day who came forward and told her story. She was 14 years old. She had been 14 years old, and her mother worked out of town during the week, so she would be away, and then she came home over the weekends. Her partner brought multiple partners into the home during the week while her mother was away. Now, for some of you, because of your cultural and class position, you'd say, well, if it was me, I would tell my mother. Well, for her, because of her position, her culture, her gender, she said nothing. All the while knowing that her mother was at risk. Her mother contracted HIV and AIDS and blamed her when she began to understand the full context of what took place. The story was performed out very carefully, but she became overwhelmed at the end, and she got up and she walked out. And we had someone else there who caught her and stayed with her and worked through. And obviously, something like this has not always happened, and it raises issues about ethics and safety and all sorts of things. But she came back into the room, and by that time, the audience had started kind of talking and processing what had happened, and they applauded, and they supported her. And it was in that moment an extraordinary transformation took place, because there was a sense of a community being able to say, you do not have to carry the shame. This is not your fault. You can be who you are. And if we can begin to start doing that in our work, where we witness and we validate one another's experiences, maybe some changes will begin to take place. So there are many principles that we work with, and I'm not going to mention them all, but ethics is really important. The ethics of what we do, and it has to do with fundamental human rights. And there's another part that I want to just mention, and that is supervision. That really what we need to start doing is cultivating spaces where there is supervision support, spaces to reflect, regardless of whether you are the teacher or the learner, regardless of whether it's on an individual or group basis, but that any work that one is engaging with is absolutely essential. The other part of the work for me that is essential is that breaking the boundary down between the academic institution and what is called community. In South Africa, community is often used with all sorts of values underpinning. It's almost like a lowest status comment. Our students are constantly working and engaging with community so that their learning is embodied and at the same time engaging with intellectual ideas around the work that has been done. So we're interested in the reflective practitioner. Are we educating theatre people? Yes, we are. But you know what? We're not just educating theatre people. Many of our graduates are now working in migration studies, development studies, public health, a range of areas, education. And what's really important is this notion of the reflective practitioner. The ability to look through someone else's eyes and the ability to stand in their shoes and look back at you and know your position. And so in closing, I want to end with a production that is going to be moving in here as soon as TEDx is finished here today. It's called Through Positive Eyes. And what we've done is, as a group of actors, we've worked very closely with a group of adults who are all HIV positive. They're all open about their status. They're activists. And we have worked with their stories. So imagine one-to-one, someone comes to you and says, I'm going to tell your story. I'm going to tell all of your story. I'm going to get to know everything about you. And I'm going to then stand on the stage and I'm going to witness you through this performance. And it started with a process of Gideon Mendel and David Gear from UCLA taking photographs and teaching them to take photographs of their lives. And then us, the performers, coming in and working with their stories. And some of these images are of the storytellers, not the actors, the HIV activists. This is Mlungisi. This is Lindy. It's her self-portrait. 2 years later. And I would like to leave you with the idea that perhaps what we're all needing to do is, regardless of our background, of our religious beliefs, spiritual beliefs, we have to find ways in which to reconnect and understand one another. Thank you.